My other crime was by saying that this is a proxy war. And it totally is a proxy war when the US and NATO have been the ones, for starters, destabilizing the region in the run-up to the war, provoking the situation and preventing peace since it started, and basically creating the climate where the Ukrainians are expected to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, because that's the only direction where it's going. This nonsense that, oh, Russia is being defeated. It may be a major headache for Russia. And some people might say, well, it serves them right. They shouldn't have done that in the first place. Well, okay, but think where that's leading you by saying that. What you're actually saying is who you want to pay that price is ordinary people in Russia, ordinary people in Europe, and first and foremost, ordinary Ukrainians who are going to be the ones at the receiving end of that war in terms of bullets and tanks and all the rest, and increasingly ordinary Russians and people caught up in Crimea or wherever. So that's...
Hello, this is Pascal, and I'm here again with Clare Daly, who really anyone interested in peace should know by now, I believe. She's a very outspoken pro-peace and pro-democracy member of the European Parliament. She is Irish. She was member of the Irish Parliament too, but she's now in Brussels, and she generously agreed to talk again. Thank you so much, Clare, for taking the time once more.
Thanks for your interest, Pascal. Nice to talk again.
Clare, let me start with this one. I mean, what's going on with the European Union? Why is the only thing we hear from the EU more sanctions, more weapons, more confrontation, and no peace proposal? By now, even Turkey has a better track record of trying to broker diplomatic peace between Russia and Ukraine. What is the European Union doing or not?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a question I ask myself every morning because it's so patently against the interests of EU citizens for them to have this stance, not to mind the people of Ukraine or indeed the people of Russia. I thought it was interesting that even Angela Merkel came out in the last week again and said, listen, we can only have sort of peace in Europe with Russia being involved. And of course, she got absolutely slated across the board from the, I suppose what we call, I would call them Europhile warmongers, but they're actually Atlanticist warmongers because they have been completely captured now, most of the political establishment in the EU, as distinct from their populations clearly, are completely captured by the US and seem to be dancing to the US and NATO's tune rather than what they should be doing, which is protecting their own citizens in their own countries. It's shockingly frightening, and I think it's a reflection of, I suppose, on the one hand, the very weak nature of the European Commission that we have this time. They're very lightweight, headed by Ursula von der Leyen, but a lot of commissioners are really lightweight. You have some very zealous sort of Russia-phobic leaderships in some of the Baltic states and Poland and so on, and that's feeding into what was this, I suppose, rump states in the European Union are now actually setting the diplomatic scene for the others to follow. So we have gone down a very scary road, but it's patently not in the interests of the people of Europe for sure.
And, you know, since we last spoke in April, when you so forcefully came out against more weapon deliveries for Ukraine, and since then you voted again in a resolution just, I believe last week, that called for even more weapons. And you were once again criticized for not condemning Russia enough. Unjustly so, because I believe you've stated several times that you condemn the invasion of Ukraine very much, and you tabled an amendment, if I got it right, to that resolution that proposed seeking peace through negotiations and neutrality for Ukraine. This is one of the first or only serious neutrality propositions that I saw coming from the Western side, and that was heavily rejected. At least that's what I read in the papers. Could you tell us what that resolution was about?
There was a couple of amendments, and it was very interesting. And you're totally right that we were criticised. And again, of course, this was a big resolution. It wasn't a resolution on condemning the Russian escalation, so we couldn't not vote for that because it wasn't on that, but it was on the Russian escalation, and it contained 25 paragraphs. Some of them condemned Russia in terms of the recent annexation and the referendums and so on. We supported those paragraphs. What we didn't support was the paragraphs which call for more weapons, more arms, the sending of Leopard tanks. We're even naming the types of arms that are going in now, more sanctions. So all of the policies which never worked already in the last 7 months, we're going to do that again. But, you know, there was even phrases in it that the hesitant countries, which means the neutral ones like my own, even though they haven't been neutral, but that's another story, but they're supposed to be, that the hesitant countries would have to get behind this in terms of supporting military activity. And as you say, shockingly, we had an amendment down, and it wasn't actually on Ukraine's neutrality, it was on calling on the parliament to get behind a dialogue for peace and to do everything in its efforts to bring about an immediate end to the war. That was defeated by over 400 votes to 100. Could you believe it? Like literally no strings attached, just that the Parliament would do, that the EU would do everything in its power to bring about a peaceful resolution and an immediate end to the war. And it's patently clear now that the US and UK in particular, but followed along like little lapdogs by some in the EU, do not want this war to end. And they are captured by the arms industry, by the NATO war hawks, by the US administration, who seem to be perfectly content to allow this war to continue on at pretty much the level it's at now. Now, that's a highly dangerous game, because this myth that's out there that, oh, you're only saying this now because the Ukrainians are winning. Well, A, we've been saying this since the start of the war. B, that's a very peculiar way of calling winning, because what is winning? I mean, they've made some little gains at the moment, and that's fine. In fairness, the Ukrainians have shown they are heroically willing to fight and sacrifice themselves, but they've already sacrificed thousands, displaced millions, and their country is severely disrupted, and it's only going to get worse because the recent situation is going to be responded to by a Russian escalation, which is patently not in the interests of the people of Ukraine, or indeed the 300 people who are going to sign up to have to join the Russian army, and we have the threat of nuclear in the background. So if you call that winning, that's a pretty strange definition of winning now. That is not winning. And for me, the biggest shame, and you know, you mentioned that I'm Irish, and you know, Ireland gained its membership on the UN Security Council in election by going around the rest of the world and selling ourselves on the basis of our time-honoured peacekeeping and our neutral status. And we got support from countries all over the world for that. We're on the UN Security Council. Shock and horror, there's a war in Europe. And what do? We, who got that position on the basis of our neutrality, have used it to prostitute ourselves to the war hawks and bend over backwards to appease the US, NATO, which we're supposed to have nothing got to do about it, because we want to be the best little Europeans in class. And I think this is shocking. And it's particularly shocking when we saw the initiative taken by Mexico at the recent UN Security Council last month, when it was Mexico, all of those thousands of miles away, similarly elected to the UN Security Council, similarly like Ireland, previously conquered. Similarly, they have a pacifism and a constitution which argues for peaceful resolutions of disputes, and they table a resolution for a peaceful dialogue and negotiations, and to try and get something together under the auspices of the UN, maybe with the assistance of the Pope or somebody like that, to bring about a climate of de-escalation, reducing tensions so that a ceasefire could be considered, and then the idea of real negotiations. But of course, Ireland didn't even sign up to that. There were 66 General Assembly countries which supported that idea, including 3 from Europe, Hungary, Portugal and Malta. Ireland didn't even sign up to that. I mean, how sick, like, so the countries representing the majority of the world's populations have supported a UN call for peace. And yet the minority countries in the white Atlanticist camp, again, are obstructing progress. It's scary.
But I don't understand how this is happening, because like we do now have a peace faction even in the West, and that peace faction is strange because it is what I call the real left and, let's say, the realist right. I mean, especially when you look to the United States, you have now people like Jimmy Dore, a very lefty guy who also talked about you, by the way, on his show. Like you were mentioned quite a lot by him. And then you've got Tucker Carlson, this right-wing guy, right? both of them saying like we need to de-escalate this situation because this is way too dangerous and this is not in the interest neither of the people in the US nor of the people in Europe. And we have the same, this even stranger bedfellows like Noam Chomsky and Henry Kissinger both saying this needs de-escalation. Janusz Varoufakis on the same side with John Mearsheimer that want to end the war. But we have a huge neoliberal kind of very one-dimensional pro-war faction. And what's this in the European Parliament? Do you see this as well, left and right converging on this, or is it only one side? And how do you make sense out of this whole we have to do war in order to get peace mentality?
It's very similar in the European Parliament, except it's even more extreme. I mean, we do have, I mean, I think the numbers for the motion were very small again, like there's over 700 members of Parliament. The people who voted against the recent motion and abstained was probably again around 50, adding the two together. And they generally came from, so that isn't all the left, it's a minority actually in the left group who would have done that, but probably maybe 50% would come from the left group, but the other half of the left group voted for the motion. And you would have some on the extreme right as well, but you'd also have some really extreme right very much for the war as well. So it's kind of, I suppose it depends where your country comes from, but certainly, I mean, people around the Marine Le Pen's party would be generally voting against the war. Actually, Alternative for Deutschland, in the far right in Germany. And this is really interesting, and it's a reaction to the fact, I think, that the biggest warmongers in Germany are actually the Greens, sadly, because they're very good on other issues. And it's a sort of backlash that you have on that. But that's only getting us into a very scary situation. And the consequence of it is that that middle ground, the so-called centre that we hear so much about, actually doesn't really exist. It's the centre that has failed. Like, it's just bent over in the interests of, I think they're just dancing to the tune of all of these, I suppose, well embedded think tanks and purchase of the media by the US. I mean, it's laughable. They're always going on about the amount of money that Russia spends on financing political groups and stuff in Europe. And do they? For sure they do, but not a fraction of what the US spends, and they can master the mainstream media and the mainstream political establishment, and now they're getting payback. But it is peculiar, but it's a consequence, I think, of a lot of the people who would be waking up to what's going on now are some of the people were the ones who were skeptical about the way the state responded to the COVID crisis and so on. In some ways, ironically, their reaction about the war is a reaction to the creeping totalitarianism that's existing in Europe. So people who are skeptical of the political order, or maybe susceptible to, you know, all sorts of conspiracy theories and that, and not all conspiracy theories are wrong, mind you, but, you know, people who'd be susceptible to that, it's a backlash to the fact that actually the mainstream is shutting down dissent and dialogue, that you can only have one view. And it was a bit like that in COVID, that if you ask questions, you're immediately condemned as an anti-vaxxer. If you ask questions or raise, should we not be ending this war a different way? Maybe there should be peace. You're immediately condemned as a Putin puppet or a Kremlin stooge. And people are reacting to that, and they can see that's not healthy. I mean, how could it be? I mean, as you said, we've been vilified and demonized, and actually our biggest crime, if you want to strip away all the rhetoric, is that we might have a different view on ending the war to those so-called people who say they want to end it by throwing in more arms. But as I pointed out to them, these newfound peace lovers who had no problem supporting the war in Afghanistan and Iraq and all the rest, you never hear them calling for arms to Palestine or arms to the people of Yemen or anything like that, because of course they would never put that forward, because everybody knows sending arms into a conflict doesn't help. And history has been rewritten in this one, that suddenly this is the first conflict where if you send in arms, it's going to end it. Well, guess what? We've been at that nonsense for 7 months now, and it's further from a resolution. And actually the 3 attempts that there were for the Russians and the Ukrainians to sit down, it was the West who scuppered them, mainly the US and the UK, but the EU is responsible for not doing enough either. And I was glad to hear Angela Merkel speaking out, even though she got condemned for it, and I wouldn't have any political associations with her normally. But the Pope has been silenced on this, but the majority of the world's population don't get a say in the Western media. But I have to say it is changing. For sure it's changing, because before I forget this point, like you're right, we did get criticized for the vote. Completely different than it was 9 months ago, 7 months ago. Now it's much more, the negative reaction is much less, and actually a lot more positive reaction. And that is all across Europe, all across the world, but in Ireland as well. And it may be that people haven't got a vehicle for how they express it. So many people say to us all the time, I can't listen to television, or I can't read a newspaper anymore because this nonsense is coming on. It doesn't relate to what I feel, and it's just doing this, so I disconnect. And then they say, but I'm so glad you're saying that. But if you added up all the people who are saying that, they're clearly a majority in Europe. And this is just another example of how the political leadership in Europe don't represent the citizen. Then they go, oh my God, the people are disenfranchised because they're susceptible to Russian propaganda, has them. And this is all we get, like, you know, it's the Russians who are doing it.
And you're being highly criticized for that. And anyone who says that this should be ended through diplomacy is highly criticized for that. I mean, you are now on a Ukrainian government list of people who propagate Russian narratives. I can show that later here. You're on that list, as in on the watch, together with people like Mearsheimer and so on. I mean, dissent. There's a clear movement to stifle any kind of anti-war dissent, and anti-war in the sense of pro-diplomacy with Ukraine. Can this go on?
This was a very sinister development that took place in the summer, and it's a sort of, as you say, an international bold list compiled by the Russian or a Ukrainian department under the leadership of Zelensky himself. And international figures have been placed on the people who have no political agreement at all, from, as you say, the right to the left. Lula from Brazil is on it, people like that. The only thing they have in common is questioning the US NATO narrative on this war. And my crime, the two charges against me on it, were that I had the audacity to say that sanctions hurt the people of Europe. Okay, stand over that one, guilty as charged. You only have to look at what's happening in Europe now and the winter of discontent that's going to be before us, a cold and expensive winter, to know that that's true. But even little examples in my own country, there's a bunch of workers who work for a Russian aviation leasing company. The company shut down because of the sanctions. It wanted to pay its workers their bonuses and their redundancies, and because of the sanctions, the Irish workers haven't got it. So patently true, sanctions hurt ordinary people. You know, my other crime was by saying that this is a proxy war. And it totally is a proxy war, when the US and NATO have been the ones, for starters, destabilizing the region in the run-up to the war, provoking the situation and preventing peace since it started, and basically creating the climate where the Ukrainians are expected to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, because that's the only direction where it's going. This nonsense that, oh, Russia is being defeated. It may be a major headache for Russia. And some people might say, well, it serves them right. They shouldn't have done that in the first place. Well, okay, but think where that's leading you by saying that. What you're actually saying is who you want to pay that price is ordinary people in Russia, ordinary people in Europe, and first and foremost, ordinary Ukrainians, who are going to be the ones at the receiving end of that war in terms of bullets and tanks and all the rest, and increasingly ordinary Russians and people caught up in Crimea or wherever. So that's scary. Now, this list, it's dangerous as well, because we do know that they'd similar lists before, like the young journalist, the daughter of the cleric who is close to Putin, and she was on a list, and that list afterwards said basically terminated. So we know that these lists are being compiled against the backdrop when the borders of Europe are open, and when everybody knows that a big section of the weapons that have been given out are unaccountable for and are going to be used. So anybody on that list could potentially be a target. So this is silencing alternative opinions, and it's completely in line with what the Zelensky government has done at home also, by rounding up oppositionists, putting journalists in jail, rounding up people of a different political view, shutting down on the trade unions, all of that stuff. And yet we're told this is a battle of democracy versus authoritarian. Sounds pretty authoritarian to me. If the Chinese had done a list like that, can you imagine if there'd been a list of European people, the Chinese, we'd be having emergency meetings, the Council of Europe would be called to say this is an outrageous attack. Instead, that list was published and no one really said anything, you know? It's horrible. Yeah.
It's outrageous. And sorry, completely different question, and probably this can only be done through speculation, but in the European Parliament, do you have any kind of information more than we have on the Nord Stream pipeline attacks? Is there anything going around or not?
The biggest thing going around is the eerie silence around it, because we've tried to bring this up on a number of occasions, and if you needed kind of further proof of this, the fact that nobody is asking questions or wanting to know except us kind of gives you the answer you're looking for. So we had asked for, saying it seems pretty unrealistic now that the Russians would blow up their own pipework. The environmental damage and alone from this should be causing severe concern in Europe. And we actually got an amendment passed in the Parliament. I think they must have been asleep, or some of them might be thinking, oh, it's the Russians who did it. But basically condemning the explosion and asking for an independent investigation. We actually managed to get that through on a different resolution because of the environmental damage to the ocean in terms of the release of methane and so on. But I mean, to me, it makes no sense that that would be Russia at all. And when you add that to the statements previously from Victoria Nuland and the clear statements of Biden, where he said we will get Nord Stream 2 one way or another. I mean, I don't know. How do I know it's the US? No, I don't. But I definitely know there was no interest in Russia doing it. It would be completely stupid of them to do it. So what we've called for is an independent investigation, and that's not the US going, oh yeah, we'll investigate that. No, that's not an independent investigation. But I mean, this is an act of economic and environmental sabotage carried out on property of the German government in part, and nobody in the EU is kind of saying, that might be a bit problematic. Now, that in some ways is the scariest thing of all, that the political leadership in Europe is prepared to have an act of economic and environmental sabotage committed on its territory and doesn't even ask a question about it. My God, we really have lost the plot here.
Last question of substance, like there's an 8th round of sanctions now that the EU passed, and part of it is very close to the US secondary sanctions. The EU is now going to sanction third-party countries if they try to circumvent EU sanctions. Is this another escalation of how the EU tries to do tries to pressure other countries?
Yeah, but I'm not so sure they're going to succeed on this one. You know, they moan around at the committees. They kind of go, these other countries now in Africa and South America, I mean, they're so much the victim of Russian propaganda. You know, it's just like that they're not behind our war effort kind of thing. And we go, sorry, you do know that a lot of those countries have a massive record of imperialist intervention, wars of their own coming from ye and your side. So it's not that they don't sympathize with the people of Ukraine. It's just they know there's been other wars before, many of them even more horrific than that, and you didn't care about them, blah, 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 blah. So I don't think it's going to be that easy for them to bully others, because needs must at the end of the day, and they will continue to do business with Russia. I think it's a sign of desperation. And I suppose the hope I get from the present is that I do sense a change in a mood of the citizens of Europe. They may not yet have got to a place where they can express it, but as I say, the feedback we get has been absolutely phenomenal. You'll have seen the massive protests in France over the weekend against NATO, against the war. There's been similar ones in the Czech Republic, big movements in Italy, I think beginning in Germany, and winter hasn't even started yet. So I do think people are going to say, hang on a minute, this is not achieving what you said it would. So I think the sanctions then in that sense are going to have to go a little bit on the back foot. So look, let's see. I mean, I really would love if Mexico's initiative took root. And it was interesting that there were attempts earlier in the year for a peace agreement, and Putin, in one of his speeches recently, referred back to them. They are the bones of a way forward. This idea of which was actually put forward by the Ukrainians in March and not picked up by the media at all, of permanent Ukrainian neutrality. Non-military basis, nothing but that would be guaranteed by the international community, including Russia, which sounds a bit mad, but not an alliance like NATO, but a structure that occurred in the 1800s around like Belgium, that the international community in its entirety agreed to secure the neutrality of Belgium because of its thing. And that worked for 100 years, you know, and this will be the same. And part of that agreement was actually that the Ukraine wanting to join the EU would be facilitated and encouraged. So a bit like a Finland kind of thing, that they could be in the EU, but not militarily a threat to Russia. I think that's the bones of a way forward if the Ukrainians are allowed to sit down and negotiate with it. But I think the people of Europe will be part of putting pressure on their establishment. It's not a coincidence that it's now that Merkel is coming back out, because the German economy is on the cusp of a major economic wallop here. All the political parties are in crisis and they need to get a grip, or their own countries are going to spiral out of control. So maybe out of that madness, we'll see an end to the sanctions and a supporting of the idea of dialogue, which is the only way forward.
That would be absolutely fantastic. Claire, I'm sorry, I have to let you go because you have got your next interview, but thank you so much for taking the time of talking here.
Thank you, Pascal. Nice talking to you again.
And everybody follow Clare Daly on her Twitter. She's active, and you get support from a lot of places.
We do. Just before you go, we have a podcast, myself and my colleague 𝗏𝗏𝗂𝐿. Yep. It's I4C as the number, the letter I4, the number 4C. It's the grouping we're called Independence for Change, but I4C, trouble with Daly and Wallace. So it's kind of a pun on I4C, trouble, you know. But anyway, with Daly and Wallace, and we cover all of the events of the European Parliament every week.
We'll put everything of that into the description. People follow Clare Daly. Claire, best of luck, and talk to you again.
Thanks so much. Talk again. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.